We are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on Zoom and to who is watching the video on YouTube. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for the opening of a two-day virtual conference on the global governance of plastic pollution, hosted by the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, with support from several collaborating partners. The opening session you are now attending is part of the Geneva BIT Plastic Pollution Dialogues, which have kept the international community in Geneva engaged on this topic in the past months, making links with numerous processes in international Geneva to tackle plastic pollution and with the United Nations Environmental Assembly. As you have seen in the outreach materials, these dialogues are organized by the Geneva Environment Network in partnership with international organizations, governments, non-governmental organizations, and academia. In the margins of this week's Ministerial Conference on Marine Litter and Plastic Pollution, and in the run-up to the second part of the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, we will continue being active with our partners so please stay tuned for announcements of further dialogues. I have now the pleasure to leave you with Carolyn DEERE, who together with Diana Barrowclough from UNCTAD is the convener of the 2 days conference we are opening now. Carolyn is a senior researcher at the Graduate Institute's Global Governance Center and the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and SDGs. Carolyn, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Diana. And this conference comes at such a timely moment. On Wednesday and Thursday this week, we have a ministerial conference here in Geneva on marine litter and plastic pollution, jointly organized by Ecuador, Germany, Ghana, and Vietnam, with the technical support of UNEP. So we're really delighted to host this conference at such a timely moment and to collaborate with the Geneva Environment Network on this first opening policy event. Before introducing our panel, I'd like to thank our partners in the conference, which include the Center for International Environmental Law, UNEP's Environment and Trade Hub, and the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs. And a really special thanks to my colleagues at the Graduate Institute's Global Governance Center and the Geneva Trade Platform for their wonderful support in preparing this event. So one more thanks is I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the financial support of the Swiss Network of International Studies, which has enabled our efforts over the past 2 years to spur research and policy dialogue on the global governance of plastic pollution. And this conference marks the end of that 2-year collaboration. Today, we're delighted to open our conference with an amazing lineup of stakeholders to provide their views on the proposed Global Treaty on Plastic Pollution. They'll offer ideas on its scope, its purpose, what it should include. In keeping with the theme of our wider conference, we've asked speakers to consider how a potential treaty might also help advance the transformation of the plastics economy, which will be necessary to tackle this huge plastic pollution crisis. So you can find links to the bios of the speakers on our website, which will be reposted now in the chat. As we have a big lineup and we aim to keep within our 1-hour time slot, each speaker will speak strictly for 5 minutes. Please do post questions in the Q&A and our speakers will endeavour to answer some of them over the course of the event. And you could also feel free to post resources that you would like to share with participants in the chat. So to start us off, please join me in welcoming Leticia Carvalho, who is the head of UNEP's Marine and Freshwater branch. We've asked her to start us off with a quick overview of the evolution and state of play of discussions on this topic in the United Environment Assembly, which provide the backdrop to proposals for a new treaty. Leticia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear and see me well. And thank you very much, Caroline, for this kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be part of the session of the second series of the Geneva BIT Plastic Pollution Dialogues. And thanks and congratulations for your leadership on this topic. So let me, without further delay, just address how did you get here? And if we pay attention in the trajectory of the United Nations Environment Assembly, we will check that since the first one in 2014, governments have adopted resolutions directly addressing the issue of marine litter and microplastics and plastic pollution, as well as various other resolutions linked to the issue of plastic pollution overall, not only on the marine environment. This clearly demonstrates the high level of political will in this topic and highlights the urgency of developing solutions to the global crisis of plastic pollution. Let me remind you all that in November 2020, the ad hoc open-ended expert group on marine litter and microplastics that was set under the auspices of UNEP, the United Nations Environment Assembly. And its chair summary highlighted the following: maintaining the status quo was not an option. The necessity of further actions across the life cycle is required to address marine litter and microplastics and plastic pollution in moving forward, including through a circular economy approach. And it was clear that the cost of inaction exceeds the cost of taking action to protect the environment and the human health. UNEP is really pleased that there are a number of ongoing parallel processes led by countries in order to garner momentum and keep these discussions at the highest level of the political agenda. As Caroline already mentioned, we are supporting the co-conveners, namely Ghana, Ecuador, Vietnam, and Germany, and hosting the ministerial conference that will take place in Geneva, as already mentioned, over this week. Dear participants, the science is absolutely clear. UNEP is preparing to launch a report that is called From Pollution to Solution, a marine litter and microplastic assessment that takes very important conclusions on the status and the impacts of the plastic pollution into the ocean, but not only. Actually, this report is considering the impacts over the environment and many different ecosystems overall, and also to the human health. And the most appealing for this conversation in this roundtable, marine litter and plastic pollution as the most visible part of the problem of the plastic pollution is also significantly affecting the global economy. Costs relating to the greenhouse gas emissions, human health, invasive species, and cleanup operations mount up to a staggering $350 trillion a year. By 2040, plastic waste is expected to present an annual financial risk of $100 billion for business that would need to bear the costs of waste management at expected volumes. So I think with that appeal, economic appeal, that is part of these very important discussions, I conclude the set the scene, looking forward to keep engaged in this conversation over the next hour. Thank you very much, Caroline, and hopefully I managed the time. Back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for Leticia for bringing us up to date and exactly on time. I will turn swiftly now to Eirik LINDEBJERG, who is the Global Plastics Policy Manager at WWF. Eirik has been a leading campaigner on the Plastic Pollution Treaty over the last year, and so I'm delighted to turn the floor to him. Eirik, please take the floor.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Carolyn. And over the last couple of years, I would say, as this has been a process ongoing for at least since 2016. But it's really now a pleasure to see the momentum building so much. It is, as you mentioned yourself, extremely timely to have this conference leading up to the first ever, actually, global ministerial conference dedicated to plastic pollution that will happen in Geneva and in a hybrid form, I guess, this week. The global plastic pollution problem and the global plastics economy is, we can say, I dare to say, completely unregulated. At an international level. There's been some attempts by governments to deal with some of the consequences recently, but it's not at all adding up to the action that we need to see. And that's really where the calls for an international treaty are coming from. We heard Leticia mentioning the enormous consequences that this has, not only for the environment, but also on human health and the economy. So the momentum is there now really for a global treaty on plastic pollution. More than 100 governments have officially in different official communications expressed an interest to work for and establish a negotiation mandate, get negotiations started on a global treaty. And I think that looking at the plastics problem, compare it to any other, almost any other. There are also still some that we need to work on in the future, but most global environmental problems have a good regulatory, or have a regulatory framework. Some are not working at all. There are a few examples of some that are really working very well, with, of course, the Montreal Protocol being the most cited example of a successful treaty. This is completely lacking on plastic pollution. So it's not only that we have a weak governance framework, but it doesn't exist at all. And that means that for any business operating and trying to solve this plastic pollution crisis themselves, they will have to deal with different legislation in all different countries, different standards on what is a recyclable plastic product, different waste management practices, both at the national level and even at the local level. So it becomes a very difficult and a split up approach to solve the problem. And this is really where a plastic pollution treaty can come in and provide that coherent strategy to solve this at the global level. We think that we need not only a form of global agreement, but we need a proper legally binding mechanism that provides the global framework for dealing with the problem, that sets a clear global goal to minimize and eventually eliminate plastic pollution into nature. We need monitoring, reporting mechanisms and a scientific body that can make sure that we are actually heading in the right direction. And we need a harmonized regulatory framework that can set the standards, so it will become easier to recycle and deal with a product in one country that was produced in another, to put it very simply. This conference happening in Geneva this week is hopefully the very first step to get to such a global agreement, and we hope that the United Nations Environment Assembly will adopt the necessary negotiation mandate to get there. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you very much, Eirik, for a really succinct presentation of the rationale for a treaty and exactly what you think that it could do. So on that note, I'm going to turn to Karen RAUBENHEIMER. Karen is a lecturer at the University of Wollongong, and she's been a really trailblazer in this area and has published, including publishing with Nico Urho last year, an excellent paper which I can recommend to everyone on the possible elements for a plastic pollution treaty, which was published by the Nordic Council of Ministers. Karen, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to participate here tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the first Nordic report that I co-authored with Nico Urho on the possible elements of a new global agreement. In this report, sustainability criteria were central to the architecture and implementation of a new agreement. We also outlined a hierarchy within the global agreement for sustainability criteria, for guidelines, and for national standards. I presented this hierarchy in the previous Geneva dialogues, but today I think I'll elaborate a little more on this with a focus on the role of the global sustainability criteria, what they would look like in an agreement, and what they would aim to achieve. So firstly, what do we mean by sustainability criteria? These criteria would provide broader guidance on product design than what stricter design standards would, and they would focus on the environmental performance of materials and products across the life cycle, particularly at the end of life. So I believe the sustainability criteria are the key underlying mechanism an agreement must deliver in order to achieve a sustainable consumption and production model for plastics on a global scale. As per the hierarchy presented in the Nordic report, the first level would see sustainability criteria outlined more broadly in a new agreement, but at the second level, further detailed in annexes, protocols, and guidelines. And finally, then at the third level, they would provide the tool for countries to adapt their legislation and processes through voluntary and mandatory market-based instruments that suit the local context and protect livelihoods. These sustainability criteria, negotiated at the international level, must aim to ultimately improve product design across the global value chain. The need for improved design has been stated a number of times at the intergovernmental level. The draft statement of the ministerial conference hosted by Ecuador, Germany, Ghana, and Vietnam echoes the UNEP resolutions, and it states that preventive measures should be prioritized, designing out plastic waste and pollution, as well as fostering reusability, recyclability, and repairability at different levels. So the many resolutions and statements that we've already adopted provide a starting point for the type of broader language that could be negotiated when defining the sustainability criteria of a global agreement at the first level, and then further detailed at the second level. So product design was also a key component in our recent article in Science that Nils Simon will discuss later in the panel. So these global sustainability criteria could play a central role in two ways, I believe. Firstly, sustainability criteria must provide the environmental performance boundaries within which industry innovation is permitted to take place. If materials and products are fit for reuse, remanufacture, recycling, etc., in the local context, it will provide the first step to giving them value at the end of life and driving the economic transformation we wish to see in the global plastics value chain. But product design will not be successful on its own. So the second component a global agreement must promote is the national legislative frameworks that must actively drive investment in the necessary collection, sorting, and recycling services. These processes will all benefit from better designed products. And this is where the sustainability criteria of the agreement must be activated through national market-based instruments. Adopting such measures at the national level was one of the three key national commitments we put forward in the Nordic report. The sustainability criteria are closely linked to the role of trade policies as outlined in the report that Carolyn led. They provide a mechanism for countries to control the types of materials and products placed on the domestic market, particularly if they do not meet these criteria. Through tariff and non-tariff measures, they can reduce the manufacture and trade of hazardous, non-essential and problematic products and promote those that don't generate residual waste, partly because they will have greater value at the end of life. They can form the foundations of product stewardship schemes to subsidize and promote investment in infrastructure and services. A new agreement must promote and support the adoption of these instruments at the national level, and many countries are well advanced with such schemes already. So the aim of the global and national sustainability criteria is therefore threefold. Firstly, reduce or eliminate the unnecessary, avoidable, and problematic products that do not meet the criteria or design standards, promote circularity through design and investment according to the waste hierarchy, and reduce hazard across the life cycle of plastics. By defining these global sustainability criteria within a new agreement, we can then further support the setting of global and national targets, indicators, and certification schemes to improve transparency and help us verify our progress in more ways than measuring the plastics lying in the environment. So with that, I thank you and I look forward to discussions.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen, and very useful to have you outline exactly how these sustainability criteria will be useful at the national level and what it will take at the national level in terms of policy and legislative frameworks to make them effective. So moving on, I'm going to turn now to Jodie ROUSSELL, who is the Senior Public Affairs Manager at Nestle, responsible for plastics and the environment. And we're really delighted to have her here today to represent some of the views of companies who are faced with tackling this tremendous issue and some of the efforts that she sees could really make progress. Jodie, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. When we look at the challenge of plastics today, we think that we need to fundamentally rethink the way we produce, use, reuse, and also dispose of plastic, either at end of life or as a recovered material. And we recognize that we at Nestle have a role to play in the global effort aimed at stopping plastic pollution, and we're committed to tackling this issue. We've set a number of concrete targets to create a circular economy for plastics and address the challenge with voluntary initiatives. Some of the voluntary initiatives we're part of are the New Plastics Economy Global Commitment with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the Plastic Pacts, today in 12 countries and growing, the National Plastic Action Partnerships through the World Economic Forum, and Resource as well for reporting on our plastic performance. We've also made two major commitments, one to reduce our use of virgin plastic by 1/3 by 2025, and that 100% of our packaging will be recyclable or reusable by the same date, 2025. When we look at the challenge of plastics and our plastic strategy, we're addressing this in 5 different ways. We're looking at redesigning our current packaging, developing new schemes for reuse and refill in conjunction with retail partners, shifting to paper and mono-material plastics away from multi-material plastics. Fourthly, looking at investment and partnership opportunities in infrastructure. This is a key area that was already alluded to by Ms. RAUBENHEIMER. There are over 40,000 different types of plastics in the market today. It's very difficult to say what is the right investment to make in recycling when so many different types of plastic are currently being used. Fifth, we're looking at shifting mindsets, shifting the mindsets and the way we think about packaging and plastics in Nestle as we look to deliver food safely with a high level of quality to our consumers, but also looking at shifting mindsets with our retail partners and also directly with consumers. Now, we think that a coordinated international response is necessary because we need to align business and government with a shared understanding of the causes of plastic pollution and a clear approach to addressing them. A full life cycle approach ranging from fossil or bio-based plastics for resin production at the upper end of the value chain, all the way through packaging production, product manufacturing, retailing to consumers, and collection and sorting and recycling of recovered materials are necessary. And we believe that by harmonizing regulatory standards, mandating the development of national targets and action plans, defining common metrics and methodologies, and supporting innovation and infrastructure development, the UN Treaty can help us do all of those things. And we think it can be done at speed and at scale. We don't have time to waste. So we believe the business imperative is clear. We have to work together to solve this problem. And we at Nestle are looking forward to doing our part.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jodie, for that overview of Nestle's role and also really succinct presentation of the kinds of action across the value chain that need to be taken. So I'm going to turn directly now to Nils. Nils Simon, he is a senior advisor at Adelphi Consulting, and we have much to thank Nils for. In fact, he published one of the first papers on this topic back in 2016, which was a scoping study on an international treaty for plastics pollution. And he's also published an article in the past few weeks with a number of colleagues in Science. So Nils, we're going to turn to you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Carolyn. And yes, indeed, it was almost about exactly 5 years ago that I think was the first, was rather an online magazine paper outlining that there should be a plastic treaty. And because I was wondering why there isn't one, because it had all the details and all the necessities to launch negotiations. And looking at this today, now 5 years later, I think we've gone a long way, mostly thanks to a lot of advocacy work from a lot of groups, but also movement in industry and elsewhere, and from governments to start pulling this off. What I'm telling you today is what we wrote down and published about 8 weeks ago in Science with a group of 14 researchers. We published an article, and Karen, who just spoke, is one of the co-authors, and it was a very collaborative process where we carved out the details and core goals that we thought a plastic agreement needs to have in order to really make a difference. So the first core goal that we outlined is the minimization of virgin plastic production and consumption, because there's no way around it. We must reduce the amount of new plastic that is being put into the system. No matter how good your waste management system is, no matter how good any recycling system will become, there will always be leakage. And right now, the growth numbers are staggering, and there's so much growth already put into the system, and that we need to reduce the amount of plastic that is being produced. Looking at the necessity to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and to reach greenhouse gas neutrality by 2050, we figured that 2040 would be the latest year by which the production of new and virgin plastic should be phased out or at least minimized, with a few exemptions for highly sensitive areas, including medical equipments. The second core goal is the facilitation of a safe circularity of plastics, which means that plastic needs to be designed for circularity based on a set of binding standards that should be negotiated within the confinements of the new agreement that hopefully is being launched at the UNEP 5.2 next year. With these technical standards also should come information sharing across borders, so that whoever ends up having to deal with plastic waste will know what is in the plastic that they ought to recycle. The third core goal of the plastic treaty that we propose is the elimination of plastic pollution in the environment. Yes, we need to reduce the overall production number. We need to design it for circularity, but there is already a lot of plastic waste out in the environment or in cities, at coasts, in the oceans that we need to reduce and that we need to get out of the environment. But of course, we first need to make sure that the amount of plastic waste that ends up in the environment is not increasing much more. And we have to make sure that the plastic waste that is out there is being removed from the environment, because it poses threats to wildlife, but also to human health and the economy. Furthermore, in the paper, we outline a set of operational elements that need to be included in the agreement that includes tracking progress, mechanisms of monitoring, assessing whether governments make progress in implementing the goals that are set in there, supporting mechanisms that include a funding mechanism for implementation, for the establishment of what we call national pollution prevention, national plastic pollution prevention plans, and last but not least, a mechanism for further strengthening and evolving of the agreement. And that also includes a science policy interface to transfer knowledge from the scientific community towards policymakers, but also the other way around. And together with my colleagues Per Olof and Maru Luisa, just 3 months ago for the Nordic Council, we published a paper on how such a science policy mechanism may look like. You can find more detail on that. I'll put the link into the chat in a minute. So that's it in the essence, what we outlined in the science paper, and I'm also looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Nils, for that overview of your excellent work on this topic. And I commend the article to everyone. It's posted in the chat for those who would like to consult it. Next, I'm going to turn to Carsten WACHHOLZ. Carsten is the Senior Policy Manager at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. As you're all aware, EMF has played a huge role in trying to promote collaboration, stakeholder engagement, and business action on plastic pollution, and particularly on a more circular plastics economy. They also supported with WWF and the Business Council, the Global BCG, Business...
Boston Consulting Group it is.
Boston Consulting Group, sorry, on a great report on the business case for a global plastics pollution treaty. So without further mistakes, I will turn over to Carsten. Have the floor.
No worries, and thank you, Carolyn. I'm happy to share a few perspectives from the Foundation on the Global Plastics Treaty as part of this excellent panel today. First of all, to be effective, we are convinced that any new governance scheme to be developed needs to acknowledge that the problem of plastic pollution starts long before plastic reaches our oceans. And so the solutions should not be framed as combating marine plastic litter only. Until now, many efforts to tackle plastic pollution have focused narrowly on improving waste management or cleanups. Others have focused on banning single-use plastic bags and reducing the use of most littered items. And we have to acknowledge that none of these measures will work in isolation, as the climate, biodiversity, and pollution crises are increasingly interlinked. So no surprise, at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we believe that addressing the plastic pollution crisis requires a concerted approach to create a circular economy of plastic. And the ambition and scope of a UN treaty will have to match the overall objective of keeping plastics in the economy and stopping their leakage into the environment. And out of necessity, as others have already mentioned, these measures relate to the full life cycle of plastic products in various sectors, which requires a multi-layered governance approach. And we need to much more reinforce different actions from various stakeholders on subnational, national, and regional level. And in terms of designing an effective global governance framework, this level of complexity will certainly cause some headaches in future negotiations. So what are the most effective policy responses that can be identified in the treaty as priority actions? Which targets, obligations, measures can be inscribed already in the legal text of a global agreement, meaning that they are applicable worldwide? Which ones require geographical or sectoral differentiation via national action plans or industry standards to make them work both in developed and in the developing world? From our point of view, the so-called Minamata Convention to protect human health and the environment from anthropogenic emissions and releases of mercury and mercury compounds can provide some inspiration in this regard, although obviously the use of plastics is far more widespread. In support of its objective, the Minamata Convention includes provisions that relate to the entire life cycle of mercury, including controls and reductions across a range of different products, processes, and industries where mercury is used, released, or emitted. This approach can well be suited to be adapted to plastics rather than relying exclusively on a piecemeal of national actions, trusting that these efforts will somehow then deliver the desired global change. Going forward, it is key in our view to build further alignment between governments around the potential elements of new treaty, building on a clearly formulated joint vision and ambitious global goals, which should be measurable, time-bound, and achievable. And some of these elements have already been highlighted by previous speakers, especially by Nils from Adelphi, so I keep it short. I think we agree at the foundation that a dedicated international scientific body will be needed with a mandate to assess and track not only the extent of the problem, but also to provide guidance on the solutions needed and review the effectiveness of existing policy measures. Then, of course, there will be some sort of national action plans for sure, ideally linked to clear targets, criteria, and metrics for progress, including robust monitoring and reporting mechanism. But most crucially, especially for developing countries, a comprehensive implementation support, including technical and operational assistance to parties with limited capacity, as well as an innovation platform to share and scale latest knowledge and solutions would be key. A finance mechanism to mobilize and channel not only public, but also private capital to parties in need of assistance to implement their national action plans and other obligations. And finally, this will certainly be up for further discussions about the granularity of a global agreement. We should consider setting up a process to develop issue-specific protocols for addressing, for instance, sector-specific challenges and or tailoring them to the conditions, to the different conditions in developed or developing countries. Maybe just to quickly follow up on our engagement with the companies in the plastic packaging value chain, I think on the highlights, what could be priority areas for discussions under the treaty, we identified last year in our New Plastics Economy Global Commitment Progress Report 3 areas. First, very much in line with what Nils said, we need to set virgin plastics reduction targets which need to be underpinned by increased action on the elimination of plastics that we do not need and on scaling up of reuse business models. But we have to also acknowledge if we implement all the solutions that we already know today, that we still need quite a well-funded research, development, and innovation agenda for those solutions and materials that we need to replace those which we cannot keep in circulation today. And finally, we just recently put out a big support paper to establish mechanisms to provide dedicated, ongoing, sufficient funding of collection and recycling, in which all industry players introducing packaging to the market provide funding, for example, through extended producer responsibility schemes. Many thanks, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carsten. That was really packed with a great set of priorities and also great analysis of where the outstanding challenges lie and some really concrete, concrete proposals for what the treaty needs to do. I'm going to turn directly now to Erin McCLUSKEY. Now, Erin is the Managing Director of the Ocean Plastics Leadership Network, which has been doing some great work in recent months to promote dialogue around these issues among many stakeholders and around the Plastic Pollution Treaty. So Erin, I hand the floor to you.
Thanks so much. Yes, hi, I'm Erin McCLUSKEY. Again, I'm the Managing Director of the Ocean Plastics Leadership Network. So I'm honored to be here among this group of experts who have been working on this for a long time. So I'd like to start with a slide. I think it's coming up. Yep. This is our chaos map. This slide is meant to induce stress because we are dealing with one of the most complicated, chaotic issues of our time. And as Eirik said earlier, we have 100+ countries that are in favor of some sort of global treaty or global instrument to address this. You have a solution spectrum from EPR to alternative materials, to advanced recycling, to plastic offsets, to reuse and refill. Many of these solutions are landmines that a lot of the organizations working on this issue disagree about. We have a financial sector that's putting pressure on ESG metrics on the plastic value chain to do the right thing. And a lot of times individuals within these companies can't do the things they'd like to because they're beholden to shareholder value metrics. We have advocacy trade groups, we have universities that are putting out incredible research year after year, NGOs from across the spectrum, from Break Free from Plastic movement to NGOs that work directly with the plastic value chain. And we have a highly confused consumer right now who are recycling at very low rates. And lastly, there are millions of waste reclaimers in the global south that are the last line of defense between plastics in the ocean. And so next slide. So for those who aren't familiar with us, we're the Ocean Plastics Leadership Network. We have a network over 110 activist industry organizations that seek to tackle the plastic pollution crisis. We are principally a capacity building organization in a chaotic and complex ecosystem, like I just showed, where positions change by the month. We've learned how to create an open channel of communication that can help all sides start to understand each other and therefore move with greater velocity to solve this issue. And we believe that in order to attempt complex systems change, like the one that we're attempting now, we need to start changing the relationship between the players within that system. And I'd just like to pause to highlight one of the draft key messages for the ministerial conference going into this week. I want to call out number 4 specifically. So global solidarity and the involvement of all stakeholders must be guiding principles. Urgent action is required by all actors, governments, industry, and civil society at all levels, local, national, regional, and international, including a strong global objective and concrete action plans and measures supported by strengthening of international and regional cooperation and the science policy interface. So, like, keeping that in mind, I'd like to go to the next slide. This year, with the support of Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund, we launched the Global Plastics Treaty Dialogues to engage all those plastic stakeholders groups in a single forum so that we can start to make a clearer picture of the challenge before us. The attendees so far have included representatives from categories that make up the plastic supply chain, NGOs that work with industry, NGOs that pressure industry, waste reclaiming organizations in the global south, the financial sector, trade groups, universities, really just everyone representing that chaos map I showed earlier. And our goal is for all stakeholders to dig into these tough issues that surround this issue. And even more importantly, for the individual governments to understand where their respective stakeholders sit so that we can move forward with an effective plastics treaty in record time. So we hosted one in March and then in last month in July, and we had over 200 attendees discuss issues from finance and infrastructure to environmental justice and human rights, and how these issues can be addressed through international agreement. We'll actually be releasing a summary report of that July session today, which includes insights and highlights from our discussions so far in the hopes that it will inform the upcoming ministerial conference. And so really just asking, how can we build momentum and how can we equip leaders within their own spheres of influence with the knowledge and understanding so that we can be setting the right targets, can communicate effectively to our networks and build ourselves as leaders? Because as Leticia said at the beginning of the session, like maintaining the status quo is not an option. And in order to build a new type of an economy, a circular economy, we'll need a new type of leadership, a leadership that is collaborative, that seeks to understand, that builds bridges. And our goal is to provide the spaces for that bridge building to happen so that this treaty can be passed, decided upon in record time. So that's all I would like to say. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erin. Excellent overview of your exciting work in this area as well. Let's turn now to Tom GAMMAGE. Tom is Ocean Campaigner at the Environmental Investigation Agency. EIA is also one of the key players and supporters of the Break Free from Plastic movement, which, as you're all aware, has played an enormous role in building civil society awareness and engagement on this issue, and really pushing forward advocacy around the idea of the treaty. So Tom, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolyn. So yeah, my name's Tom GAMMAGE. I'm an ocean campaigner and a marine biologist at the Environmental Investigation Agency based in the UK. And firstly, I'd just like to start with sharing just some small anecdotes, because as a marine scientist, I've directly observed what we might call the most visible impacts of plastic pollution. Things like removing up to 30 kilograms, 35 kilograms of plastic per meter squared in a near uninhabited UNESCO World Heritage Site in Indonesia, and seeing some pristine coral reefs degraded quite badly in a matter of just five or 6 years from tissue abrasion and the light obstruction caused by fugitive plastic waste. So when I first started working on this issue, I still very much understood it as a marine discharge problem. But as Carsten and as some others have already outlined, we know that plastic and plastic pollution is not exclusively a marine problem. As I learned, marine pollution is really just the secondary impacts, the secondary symptoms of how we produce and design materials. And this is, from our perspective, where the treaty should focus its attention. Plastic is a really precious commodity, but rather than being valued that way, it's still, as others have noted, it's negligently disposed of, it's frivolously used, but most importantly, it's and as Nils touched on quite nicely, it's irresponsibly produced still, and this is costing the economy billions every single year. So we know plastic pollution drives climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution at every stage of the life cycle, and that starts with the extraction of the fossil fuels used to produce it through refinement, production, conversion, and so on. So alongside others within the Break Free from Plastics movement, what we've done over the last few years, and alongside parallel efforts of Karen and other colleagues, is to sort of really interrogate what essential elements of global governance are needed for us to transform the plastics economy. So how do we retain all the benefits of plastic whilst eliminating all of the negatives? And so from our perspective, the levers of change really ultimately sit with focusing on the problem at source, as well as interventions through every life cycle stage. So our analysis has placed those policy needs of the treaty into 4 pillars of action, which hopefully will be shared in the chat. I'll share it after I finish. The first is monitoring and reporting. And really this is the cornerstone of any environmental agreement, but without it, we can't track progress. So from our perspective, there should be sort of 4 key objectives that should guide that monitoring and reporting pillar. Firstly, it should be to quantify the presence of plastic pollution in all environmental compartments, land, sea, air, and all aquatic systems, including polar systems. To further identify the point sources of plastic entering the environment, the quantities. Thirdly, to elucidate the impacts of plastic pollution on human health, fauna, flora, ecosystems, and habitats, and use that to adaptively inform policy. And fourthly, to monitor our transition to a safe, sustainable, and circular plastics economy, because this last objective really is particularly important, I think, especially in these discussions, just because much of the conversation to date has so far been dominated by marine pollution monitoring. And while this is really important and should be upscaled and developed, the only way that we can determine if we're moving our plastics economy in the right direction is to obligate data requirements across the life cycle, reporting requirements across the life cycle. And that should include things like reliable production volumes, the use of different additives, how much is recycled, how much is traded, and waste management, etc. The second pillar is plastic pollution prevention. This might sound similar to some of the other panelists, but this is really the core pillar. And we propose 2 objectives. Firstly, to eliminate the discharges of plastic into all environmental compartments. And secondly, to achieve a safe, non-toxic and circular plastics economy. But in order to achieve this, we really need to cap the spiraling production that's expected to quadruple by in the early 2050s and end the petrochemical subsidies that exist. And this will help to sort of drive those secondary markets and reduce the incentives for virgin that currently exist. We also need to boost domestic recycling infrastructure where it's needed and avoid false solutions, things like incineration and waste to energy. The third pillar is coordination, and as Eirik noted, there's quite a few conventions and agreements that either could be or are taking actions to address plastic pollution, but there's a lack of coherence and there's a lack of coordination between them. And so we see coordination with other and strengthening of other international and regional instruments as being central to the governance of this treaty. And the final pillar is technical and financial support. And really this is to do with the feasibility and the effectiveness of the agreement, because particularly in the case of economies in transition, who lack the financial resources, lack the technical resources, the data access and the science needed to meet the ambitions of this global agreement. And so considering this, we recommend that UNEA strongly considers a dedicated multilateral fund to facilitate those predictable funding flows and sort of drive those green jobs globally. So just to finish off, I'd just like to say, obviously, thank you to the other panelists. Thank you for the organizers and to Carolyn for mediating this session. But I think if we're serious about transforming the global plastics economy, we need a global treaty which is fit for purpose. And our analysis strongly points towards a legally binding framework with an emphasis on the upstream elements in order to facilitate that downstream action. And so upstream to us would start at the point at which plastic becomes a material. So that would be the industrial polymerization to form the resin with concurrent and mutually reinforcing interventions at each and every life cycle below that point. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tom, and also for taking us right upstream. I think a number of the speakers did mention the importance of looking across the whole life cycle of plastics, and also the reduce element that the treaty must look at sort of this reduce element in terms of plastic production. But really great to hear you really focus attention on that. So we have just under 15 minutes left for some discussion. And what I'd like to do, there have been some points in the Q&A, and so our panelists are free to pick up on any burning issues there that they wish to. But what I really wanted to throw back to each of the participants, and I'll just take them one by one, is to turn back to this issue. We've also heard some challenges today. We've heard a lot about the momentum and the rationale and what we need to do and what needs to happen. But we've heard a little less on the politics of getting there. And so I think it will be important for us to reflect a little on what are the challenges in getting some of the key countries on board here that would make it useful, and which are those key countries. How can we really harness some of that energy that Jodie and Erin were mentioning about the corporate interest in this, recognizing that there's a diversity of different company views. Some countries are really keen to move ahead on this, but need regulatory frameworks to enable them to do so. And they need a sort of even playing field internationally for them to be able to really make the investments they need to. We also know that that it will take, that there will be companies who will actively resist this agenda as well. And so it would be good to hear a little bit about the politics of how we can move forward. So on that note, I'd just like to turn to each of the panelists, and I'll start with Jodie, with Leticia, on what are some of the, what's a key priority and a key process related action that would really make a difference in the next 6 months to moving this agenda forward.
Carolyn, do Leticia late because she had a technical problem?
No problem at all. In that case, we'll turn straight to Eirik.
Thanks a lot, Carolyn, and thanks for pulling us into the political realities. I think we've heard through the panel so many good ideas and so much good analysis behind, I think, all of the panelists that we've heard, coming with some conclusions and some really good recommendations to what the treaty should and should not include. However, I think that the work is far from over. As I mentioned, there's a huge first milestone happening in Geneva this week. The next important milestone will be the formal adoption of a negotiation mandate. And even that is not a given. We need at least a majority, and hopefully most of UN member states, to agree and adopt a negotiation mandate on a new treaty. That is not easy. There will always be different interests from states interested in keeping status quo, economic interests, trade interests behind that. So it will be a fight. And what we've learned, I think, from all international processes on the environment, but also on other issues, is that public pressure is really needed. And I think there's a role for everyone, all of those in the panel here, but also all of those listening in today online, to really get this going. Citizens need to push their politicians. Businesses need to make link their serious commitments with political pressure on their governments. NGOs need to augment that pressure. We have experienced, we launched a petition in support for the new treaty, and we experienced an extreme interest by citizens and support from citizens, and we now have over 2 million people signing that petition. And I think academic institutions like some of those here today need to work on how we best design that global treaty. So there's a role for everyone, and I think that the more the merrier, and the stronger the pressure, the better, because we know there will be resistance, both to the adoption of the negotiation mandate and to strong measures within the treaty once negotiations are started. So happy to kind of start the journey officially today, although it has been going on since 5-6 years. But I think everyone is needed, and we really need to make this the Paris moment for plastic pollution, or the road to Paris starts today for plastic pollution. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Eirik, for that. I'm going to turn directly to Karen.
Yeah, thanks. So from the politics point of view, I think there's many countries that might be a bit nervous about caps on virgin plastic so early in the game. I think that's somewhere where we need to talk carefully about what we mean by that. So I think there's a lot of processes that are not working yet that we need to get working before we can fully understand what that cap might be and what those levels might be. And that's going to be different for many countries. But for me, there's a lot we can start working on in the meantime. So we have many companies that have given us really ambitious short-term targets to use recycled content. But we have a big gap in providing that content to them. So firstly, we need to sort that out. And I think the first step for that is in designing products for recyclability so that more material is available to these companies. But then also fixing the contamination and the collection rates. So I think before we really start talking about capping, and there will be a place for capping, I believe, in the future, but I think that's going to get countries a bit nervous if we dive into a capping thing too early in discussions, but it is an important part of it. So yeah, that's my opinions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Karen, for a sober assessment of what will work first. Perhaps Jodie, turn to you next.
Sure. If we look at our big picture goals, one of them is to make sure that we don't increase greenhouse gas emissions and we're eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. And the second is we don't want plastic pollution in the environment. So when we look at the political element of that, we can't forget the role that the Paris Agreement plays and that nationally determined contributions play. Many companies have already made net zero commitments. We've committed to eliminating our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 2050. This is a big task. Many other companies have made the same commitment. And I think by making the linkages between the commitments we've made under the Paris Agreement and the relationship that single-use plastics have, this is really key to connect the dots. Secondly, we want to look at jobs that can be created in collection, in sorting, and in recycling to show how the new green circular economy is going to deliver better quality and a larger number of jobs in more countries than the current status quo involving single-use plastics.
Excellent. Thank you much. Thank you so much, Jodie. And I really appreciate that you made the link with the climate issue so explicitly, because I think that much as Karen is making a very important strategic point, it's also really vital that we recognize there's this wider decarbonization agenda out there, and that will apply to the chemicals and petrochemical sector as well.
Absolutely.
There's a whole other source of energy and government pressure that can also be linked to in this respect. So thanks so much for that. I'll turn now to Nils.
Yeah, thanks. It's a bit difficult to add to all those things that were already said. Maybe just a few words. I think the doors are wide open for UNEP 5.2 launching an intergovernmental negotiation committee on a plastics treaty. And this door is wide open is mostly thanks due to, in particular, NGOs, researchers, and other initiatives, the MacArthur Foundation, WWF, Carsten, Eirik, you've done terrific work, Tom as well. So keeping up that pressure is, I think, vital. I think that governments meet on 1st and 2nd September is a very good sign in terms of, yes, they are willing to launch negotiations. It is still not a set deal. It's still not sure that at UNEP 5.2 the INC will really commence and negotiations start. But I think it is very, very likely that this will happen. And until that starts, and also while that starts, I think it makes sense to listen to the sentiment that Karen, that you provided in terms of not maybe pushing too much into this at the very forefront, or in other words, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Yes, there will be countries that will look nervously at what a cap means. In fact, what is most important in the beginning is designing for circularity, getting rid of toxic plastics, enhancing collection and recycling systems, and looking at implementation measures that can be implemented in countries in the short term as well. And maybe the last notion here is that, well, negotiating a treaty takes time, ratifying it takes time, and implementing it takes some more time. So even while all this process is underway, all nations and regions, and in fact all stakeholders, should continue their work and enhance their plastic economies, and nobody should wait until the plastic treaty is fully into place.
Great, thank you very much, Nils. Just on one of the points that you made there, I mean, I think that it's also important to note that outside the UNEP process, there are many other parts of the international system and UN agencies working on different pieces of the plastic pollution puzzle. So, you know, there's plenty of work that is still ongoing that needs support and that will help drive this change, and that can happen in a number of different fora. I think, at least from my point, the thing that we can get from the UNEP process in particular is a set of overarching goals and priorities. So whilst we might not get all the concrete measures that we want, I think this, at least for me, this broader vision and goal of looking at the whole life cycle is something we really need to insist upon as a framework for this wider set of actions. But that's enough from me. I'll turn to Carsten.
Thanks, Carolyn. I think it's crucial that starting with a ministerial conference, but all along the way towards UNEA, and then when finally formal negotiations kick in, I think we need to think hard, how do we create a positive dynamic to maintain the momentum so that everyone who's doing meaningful actions towards creating a circular economy for plastics are continuing doing the good work they are doing, but that we are leveraging these efforts to a new level. And I think in the chat there was, and the Q&A, there was some very useful discussions about creating incentives, first of all, to take part in the negotiations. So it should be not just the next multilateral environmental agreement. It must be somehow different from what we've discussed in the past. And I think the most interesting part is really for the first time to look at the upstream angle and all the ideas which have been ventilated a bit by Carmen and others. How can we link incentives of participation in the treaty so that becomes less costly? There are less costs for countries who are participating in the treaty than those who would not be part of the treaty. And that's very much linked with the relations to trade policies, I think. And if we learn new things, how multilateral environmental agreement can be developed in this regard, we probably learn also for future government structures for circular economy in other areas, not just for plastics. And obviously, as with any of those international negotiations, we need to think about quick wins. Where can countries benefit most widely and agree as a first step? Because as Nils pointed out, it will take a couple of years, and we need to keep them motivated that given the complexity of the issues, there are things to gain already on the way towards the final treaty. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Carsten. I'm going to seek your indulgence and just go 2 minutes over so that I can give a very quick moment to Erin, to Tom, and then to Leticia before closing. Erin, please.
Yeah, thanks for this question, Carolyn. We think a lot about what it will take to build momentum and political will. And one of the key gaps in the climate treaty process that catalyzed the Paris Agreement was that the multi-stakeholder capacity building and education on the process did not happen at the country level soon enough, and in cases not at all. And one of the outcomes, unique opportunities that emerged from our global plastics treaty dialogues is the opportunity to run country-specific dialogues. We have funding to start these country dialogues in Chile, South Africa, and Malaysia, and hope to expand this program to up to 70 countries in the hope of getting that running start and build capacity within these countries by organizing that activist to industry convening at this national level. And so our hope is to, that these dialogues will work hand in hand with our kind of global approach, and so sourcing concerns, strategies, and best practices from both vehicles, and the hope that it builds political will within these countries to sign onto a global agreement. So yeah, we're very much thinking about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin. Tom, super quick.
Oh yeah, thank you, Carolyn. I'd just like to echo the other panelists, but I suppose I'd just like to reiterate that, plastic is a really precious commodity. And this treaty is a real opportunity for us to be able to treat it as such. We need to keep its material within the economy, but in alignment with the waste hierarchy, the first port of call should always be prevention of unnecessary waste. And I think if we're not discussing things like caps on production and additive bans early on, then we're not priming ourselves for sort of catalyzing that system change that we need. So in terms of process, I think the priority now is to secure that broad mandate as possible for UNEP 5.2. As we know, this is not necessarily a given. There's a role for all stakeholders to play, as Eirik and others noted. But I suppose something that states could do immediately would be to support the Rwanda-Peru UNEP resolution, which will give us that broad mandate that we need to catalyze that system change. Thank you.
Great, excellent. Leticia, I think you're back online. Do I turn back quickly to you for a last word from UNEP?
Yes, thanks a lot, Caroline. I think from now and UNEP, what we need to do is to enable global solidarity and collaboration. It's absolutely clear that this challenge is transboundary. No one alone can really sort it out. No country, no stakeholder, no sector can address this alone. And really to be able to adopt the solutions at our fingertips, we need to mobilize all the evidence, innovation, technology, and momentum to this public engagement. And I think what is the most important now is to take ambitious political leadership between here and UNEP through to acting collaboratively and very efficiently in order to keep the momentum until UNEP 5.2 can resume and take important decisions. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Leticia. So I think you'll all agree we've had a really great roundup of perspectives on the opportunities, the potential goals, some of the challenges. Not everyone on the panel agrees with all of the details on exactly what should be done and what the priorities are, but this is precisely why we really need to kickstart discussions and further negotiations on this issue, because it will take time. We've heard an appeal to keep the momentum going, both in existing initiatives and also in public support for taking the treaty discussions forward. So on behalf of UNCTAD and the Global Governance Center and the Geneva Environment Network and all of our co-sponsors, I really like to thank our excellent panel of speakers for their interventions. We'll now take a 10-12 minute break, and I encourage you all to join us for our next session, which is at 2:15. And our speakers will review and update us on some of the key trends in the global plastics economy and on plastic pollution. So thank you again to everyone, and I now bring this session to a close. Thank you.